How many days have passed since the 15th of October?
It was 96 days ago.
96. All right, so I came down here prepared with some statistics about this bin, but not all of them, including its age. So I couldn't remember the age, but luckily I've got a sticker on the side of the container showing how old, well, not how old, but when the bin started. So simple math would get you to the conclusion of the age of the bin, which is 96 days. And the only stat that I really, took note of before coming down here was how many times we've actually fed this bin in the lasagna style, which is the feeding pattern that we've been utilizing here in this container for 9 feedings. And if we continue today, this would be the 10th time that we would have fed in a layered fashion. So it's not just kind of digging a hole and dropping the food in. We've actually been layering the food in using intermediate layers between the foods of bedding, paper, cardboard, whatever we had on hand. You might have noticed how easily that piece of paper tore when I just sort of bumped into it, trying to move our little worm friend aside. So I've got to be careful if I want to keep this piece of paper as a whole. It doesn't seem to be too difficult to manage. It's always kind of a little challenge for me to see how long I can keep my top coverings going. Although with these coffee filters, I usually grab the newest, freshest one from the food supply that I bought down for them as the replacement for the top covering of, I don't even know it's top covering. Its function is indicating to us where we last fed. Although in a lasagna bin, the feeding takes up a little bit larger area than usual. Usually I'll just create a little gully down the middle, but with the lasagna layers we go not only kind of big on the area but also multiple layers of placing the food in here. So the stuff that I got for them today is a couple apples that came out of the freezer. I let them thaw enough that I can slice them up into little lasagna layer thick pieces. There's also some paper, a couple soiled napkins down here that we could use to rebuild some of the lasagna layers. And some of the lasagna layers down here are fairly recently added pieces of cardboard. One of them I think was actually very fresh. One of them was pretty much just sitting on the top coverings up until the last time we encountered it, and then we put it down low. So I thought that utilizing a couple recycled pieces of cardboard that are probably still intact down here, along with a couple flimsier layers, should enable us to stack up a few layers of lasagna here. Here's another food item they're going to get today. It's some chestnut. As you can see, the expiration date is 4+ years ago. Who knows? You open this thing, it might be perfectly good, but whatever. I'm going to err on the side of caution and give it to the worms. Just one of those things that sort of ended up in the very, very back of the cabinet, and every now and then, on a rare occasion, a little bit of spring cleaning occurs in January, and that offers the opportunity to grab a bunch of old stuff out of the cupboard and either get rid of it or feed it to the worms. Usually it's maybe like a processed type food or something that you probably wouldn't want to give to your worms, but sometimes it's a more natural type thing. I bumped into one of these at least. Well, last time we were in here, it's a tea bag. I mistook it to be a piece of coffee filter. And technically, if it is the same thing as the coffee filters that we always successfully compost in our systems, then it's some sort of a paper that the worms will eventually break down. But it seems to me like maybe they haven't even gotten through the outer bag. It feels to me like there's still tea leaves inside of this thing. I see some people pulling tea bags out of their systems on occasion, presumably because the material that the bag is made out of is not compostable and probably never should have been put in there in the first place. So we'll see if these bags are paper or not. If they are, they'll go, but if they're not, they'll just linger and they'll have to get removed. Things look really nice out here. Lots of fresh castings all over the top. Everywhere I look, there's, especially over here, a whole bunch of nice castings stacked up. So we kind of took all this large chunk material and pushed it to one side. Now we've got some much nicer, finer material as we work our way down, and we'll just move that to the other side, I guess. Trying to work our way down to the first layer. I sort of breezed through the video for the last setup just to remind myself of what types of foods were fed to this system the last time we were in here, and it was stuff that you probably wouldn't expect to see many leftovers of, except for the banana peels. The banana peels are definitely a popular item, but they do take a while, so there's always leftovers when you feed banana peels. But there was also cantaloupe melon, and for some reason I'm thinking that stuff might not have lasted very long, but we'll see when we get there. This is, I don't know, every time I bump into a slightly more massive, thicker piece of paper that's not just a jumbled up wad of paper bits, I believe we've encountered another of those tea bags. So I don't remember how deep we went burying our first lasagna layer, but if memory serves me correctly, we had sort of just topped it off with, yeah, I thought we had sort of capped off the whole lasagna layer area with this newest addition, a fresh piece of cardboard. There's all kinds of worms hanging out all over it, so something tells me we actually stacked some stuff up on top of the cardboard layer. Maybe that wasn't the actual cap off to the lasagna layers. There may have been other food items sprinkled on top of this thing. There's worms all over this thing. That's pretty cool. These are the African night crawlers that I received years ago as cocoons. When they arrived, they were in these little tiny bags sent to me by the crazy worm lady, by Emily. I even have them still stacked up over on my shelf behind me. The little bags that each of the cocoon types were sent in. So I received European night crawlers, African night crawlers. So I got cocoons of all types, basically. Not all types, but all the types that I run here in my wormery, with which I created a time lapse, and we were able to actually observe the 3 different types of worm cocoons placed into 3 separate chambers of my time lapse container, reach the point where they hatch and emerge from their cocoons and occupy the container, and they grow, and it's a pretty cool video. My first 3-chambered video. I had another one that followed that in a 3-chamber container that was sent to me by the crazy worm lady. She was very, closely involved with both of my 3-chamber time-lapse videos, and those are just a couple of my creations. I've got other interesting stuff out there. So now this layer would have been sort of not a solid continuous layer, but maybe just a layer of bedding sprinkled in. We took a fair bit of creative license building these lasagna layers in terms of what qualifies as a layer. But this is actually, a little bit more in line with what we're expecting here, I guess, right? Is a solid continuous piece of material serving as the next layer. In this case, obviously, it's a coffee filter. Since I've got a nice new replacement that we could use as a feeding zone indicator on the very, very tippy top, we could use the one that was already resting out on top when we first arrived and use that as a additional layer between lasagna stacks or lasagna layers. Wow, we've got a pretty good sized chunk of leftover. It looks like we've reached the cantaloupe melon. So like here, yeah, it's not just that tough textured outer piece. It still has a good bit of leftover on it. Here you can actually see the orange color. I can see coffee stuck to this thing. I wonder if it's not been approached yet very seriously because of the coffee that was stuck to it. This one clearly got approached and nibbled on up to the point where you can't see any orange leftover melon on it. Here too, it seems like a good bit of coffee stuck to the piece of melon rind, possibly prevented access for the worms trying to get to it or even sense that it's there to bother. I don't know. we'll try to make sure that we don't have anything like that going on, materials kind of obscuring other materials. Although it's a little difficult when you try to compost the coffee. You're putting it in there and it often goes in kind of in a layer, a pretty thick layer, or kind of a mound. So it makes it a little bit trickier to try to blend it in with the surrounding materials to help its breakdown process. That's okay. We'll work it in now as we rebuild. This would have been the older of the two, I believe. This went almost all the way to the bottom, although right beneath those banana peels I could see yet another layer of something. Not a lot going on the inner layers. A lot of times it's that starchy glue that they use to construct these layers of cardboard that the worms are really attracted to. So sometimes, I guess, depending on the type of cardboard you're using, you can find a good number of worms taking advantage of that little treat inside the layers of your corrugated, but maybe here they've already either gotten it or are not finding it to their liking, whatever it is that they used as an adhesive. So here too, I guess that whole idea of the food being pressed up against something, maybe here with the banana peels resting right on top of the coffee filter right below. This might be another tea bag. Maybe that could have contributed to its long-lasting staying power. It definitely feels thinner, so it does seem like it may have been worked down, but I don't see a great worm presence here at this layer. It did seem to me like some of those earlier layers that we encountered were the spots where a lot of worms were hanging out. Down here, as we make our way down, it's starting to look like we've got a slightly more deteriorated piece of coffee filter getting nibbled away here and there in spots. I guess that big tear that I just put into it doesn't hurt in terms of breaking it up. But now we've encountered the layer that we created out of the leftover foods that we encountered last time we were in here. The last check-in 9 days ago resulted in us finding a whole bunch of leftovers of this asparagus, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with asparagus, you could see it's full of these really fine fibers. It's almost like a celery type consistency if you're familiar with celery, also having those fibers running through the entire length of the vegetable or the stalk or whatever. So the consistency of asparagus is pretty similar to that with the fibers. I would think most things have fibers. It's just the size and consistency of the fibers that we're either able to sense as we're chewing it or we don't sense it there. But yeah, looks like the worms are definitely enjoying this asparagus leftovers. There was a good bit of it. We were able to pretty densely lay them all out, broken open, to make it easier to access into a layer of their own. So that's pretty cool. I don't know if it's really necessary to go extremely disruptive on this lowest section. I think it might be best for us to perhaps just, now that we've kind of agitated it and aerated it a little bit and had a chance to check it out, maybe we should just leave all this asparagus as is so that the worms can simply continue what they're doing down there. They look busy and pretty content to be working down that asparagus after who knows how long it's been now. It was 9 days to the previous feeding. I believe there was 8 days interval between, so 2.5 weeks at this point. Asparagus is still going, but we're going to start reconstructing, I think. Now let's see if we can maybe give these chunks of leftover banana a slightly better edge by actually putting them down amongst the leftover bits of asparagus. Maybe we'll sort of treat the lower layers as the leftover layers, because we've also got a good bit of leftover cantaloupe that I'd like to also get back down into service, but we wouldn't want to jam any one layer with too much food. Got to keep putting on the intermediate carbon-based paper-ish layers so that we can have our lasagna stacking format in place. Let's start bringing in some of these foods that they got. I guess apple in my experience has taken a good bit of time for the worms to work down. But hopefully, since I've frozen this apple, hopefully it'll be able to break down a little bit more quickly than if I hadn't. Maybe we can spread the apple around a little bit. Maybe even add a little bit more banana peel. Maybe they'll sense the very worked banana peel down low and take a little nibble on it. And as long as they're already in the mood for banana, maybe they'll just keep going and start into the freshly added pieces. So this stuff came out of the freezer, was left to thaw. It's still got a little bit of a frosty feel to it. These are just a couple soiled napkins I had in my pocket. Seems a shame to just chuck them in the trash, so I've been here and there putting aside soiled napkins so I can use them as bedding in my worm feedings. For the next layer, I zipped open some of these roasted chestnuts, and I was not sure what to expect. These things have been in the cabinet for years, so I didn't know if they were going to be really rancid or stinky or what, but luckily the packaging was pretty solid and seems to have preserved them well enough that they're not disgusting. They still kind of have a decent chestnutty odor to them, but I don't know if I would dare eat them. They've got like kind of a slimy texture to them, suggesting that maybe some sort of a decomposition process has started here. I'm going to pepper in some of this coffee, but let's try to go light. Maybe we could spread it around a little bit better than we've done in the past, giving it a slightly better chance of being broken down. So let's start getting some of these layers back in service. This one we took off the upper level. Why don't we give this one the benefit of being a little bit lower down, and even the added benefit of having some of the more scrumptious food items draped out over the top of it. That should give it some good traffic, hopefully. So we'll just get all these little bits of cantaloupe rind, some of it even having some of the nice, melon on it, down into service here, but that's a pretty good layer in itself. Let's continue with recycling existing layer materials. Perhaps here, instead of just one, maybe we could put in this one, as well as the one that was serving as feeding zone indicator, draped across the top. So I'm going to bring back the one we removed early on, and at the end we'll replace it with a brand new one. Give that one a chance to get seasoned a little bit before we put it to this sort of a use in the future. But yeah, we've got what's left in that bag too. So I guess mixed in with some of the leftover coffee bits here and there, we'll even add more coffee. Alright. Hopefully, spread out enough that it's going to get some attention. I think every tea bag that I found along the way ended up somewhere over here. So maybe we'll combine the tea bags with the coffee bits. See if we can spread this stuff around and cover it all with each other. Alright, looks like we're kind of getting there. We got a couple more layers to make. I guess we could bring in this next substantial layer, another cardboard layer. It's pretty cool. And what do we got left? We've still got another soiled napkin with which we can create yet another layer. But we're definitely running low on materials to use here. Why don't we take about half to rest on top of this cardboard layer. I guess we can throw in a couple chunks of apple. Then whatever is left, I guess we can put it onto an uppermost top layer. Then we can cap off with, I don't know, what do we use to cap off with? The coffee filter at the end. Usually that's a feeding zone indicator, but maybe we'll just use it as a top covering layer to sort of close things off. I don't know. What do we got? Just this piece of paper. Yeah, I'm looking around. Not to say that it would be so terribly difficult for me to round up another piece of material with which to construct yet another layer, but I think we've done a good job stacking stuff up here and keeping to the design philosophy of a layered feeding setup. So now, before I get too far, I've totally omitted the application of grit. So before I completely forget, let's get some of that in here as well. I'm usually pretty generous with the grit, so leaving it out wouldn't have been detrimental. I see some people run their worm bins deliberately avoiding the inclusion of anything even gritty at all, just in the spirit of testing to see how the worms do without any sort of grit given to them as sort of a food supplement, and they do great. They do just fine. So it's just kind of like taking vitamins, you know. Some people take vitamins, some people don't. Most people wouldn't be able to tell the difference between someone who does or doesn't, but it's kind of, maybe that's how I think of it to a certain degree when it comes to grit. Kind of a nice to have, but you know what? If you're consuming anything like crustacean shells or eggs, you know, the shells of these things can all be ground up into a nice fine powdered material carefully and used as grit in your worm composting systems. The only reason I mention, you know, taking caution is because at least with the egg shells, I'm not sure about the crustacean shells, but that material, once it gets ground up really fine, has a tendency to get airborne and is you know, gritty enough that it could cause harm to your lungs if you inhale it. So you might hear once in a while references to taking caution with your pulverized eggshell, and that's the reason. So we did actually carefully factor in our interest in seeing how things look around the perimeter in a recent check-in by actually examining the outer edges before getting to work on the lasagna layers, because turning up these outer edges is kind of disruptive to the lasagna layers if you're not careful. So I'm just taking a careful peek, but trying to do so in a way that doesn't rip up the lasagna layers we just worked so hard on reconstructing. But you know what? This being the 10th application of this lasagna layer feeding style makes me wonder if we really need to keep going. You know, at some point I might want to just say, you know, it was kind of cool, but you know, we don't need to bake it into our everyday routine. Maybe it's time to retire that kind of fun feeding style in this container and just help it run off to the finish line. I mean, 10 lasagna feedings, as well as what I believe were maybe 2 previous feedings that were not done in that style, gets us to 12 feedings overall. And my generous bedding applications in most of my systems have been taking me to the capacity limits of most of my systems pretty quickly, a little bit more quickly than I'm used to. So perhaps driven mainly by the concern of running out of room to work in the bin, I might bring it into the application of materials to this bin, or at least materials that are going to take a while to break down. Maybe we can sort of start transitioning to faster composting type foods in a bin that's this age. Usually somewhere around 100 days of age is when I start transitioning off of stuff that I know is going to take a while to break down and start using mostly stuff that I know is going to break down pretty completely, pretty quickly, so that when the time comes to harvest the castings, it's not littered with all kinds of bits and pieces of whatnot. But that's it for today's feeding on the African Nightcrawlers 96-day-old system, something in the neighborhood of maybe getting its 12th feeding, 10 of which are now the lasagna layer styles. And it's always kind of cool to see what's going on in this bin. But I think we're pretty much done here, so I'm going to take care of getting myself cleaned up and get all these things put away. But I'm not going to waste your time with that. That stuff's boring. Before I go, though, let me really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you leave. And also, if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks so much for watching.